this is part 2 of lecture 1, picking up where I left off with the discussion of Bollstorff's review article about queer anthropology. I've already sort of run through some of the main sort of topical areas, right, where queer anthropology has made contributions. And he talks then or ends on sort of some of the more theoretical contributions of this area. One of the things he raises in the beginning of the article that he kind of returns to at the end is the difficulty of even sort of defining the subject, right? And what he makes an argument for in the end is moving toward using queer as an overarching framework or a theoretical lens versus what he describes as the logic of enumeration, all right? And what he means by this is that there's a tendency to try to enumerate, meaning list all of the different sort of topics that might fall under this category, right? This is not dissimilar from what Gutmann says at the end of his article about the anthropology of men and masculinities, right? So Bollstorff is saying instead of trying to say, here are the 27 different subjects, right, that should fall under this umbrella, instead thinking about a broader theoretical framework with which we can talk about all of them, right? So what he says about this logic of enumeration is that it's sort of atheoretical, right? So that it assumes that categories like male or female or men or women or masculinity or even things like homosexuality or heterosexuality are given concepts, and that the role is simply to find an umbrella to put them all under. Instead of that, he's saying, can we have sort of lead with the theory and think about a critical framework for looking at all of those experiences and identities, of course, but really through how these different kinds of categories get constructed in the first place, right? So he's saying instead of, as the quote says here, instead of presuming that those concepts pre-exist, instead asking how the social is produced and sustained through acts of representation. So again, this is a theme we're going to see again and again in the literature that we read here, right? So not taking for granted that these categories are the starting point of the conversation, but instead trying to think critically about ways to talk about the social processes by which lived realities come into being, okay? The other point that he makes that is related to that, and which he puts forward as, again, sort of one of the most challenging questions and goals for these areas of anthropology, is to figure out sort of how to reconcile to some extent the relationship between gender and sexuality. He points out that clearly there's a connection there, right? Gender and sexuality influence one another, and indeed he calls them co-constitutive, meaning they basically make each other, right? Like you cannot have the sexuality without the gender or the gender without the sexuality. So clearly they're sort of in an enduring sort of essential relationship with one another. But there isn't really an umbrella for making it understood as sort of all part of one thing. There still is a distinction there, right? So one of the things he suggests that is both an area of a sort of emerging contribution and a goal is to better theorize what the relationship between gender and sexuality is cross-culturally. So again, something we will see as we move forward in the course. Okay, so the final article that you read is the one that, as I mentioned, is a little bit older, but is, I think, still so valuable that I wanted you to read it. And this is really about the anthropology of the body. Shepherd Hughes and Locke, again, both of whom you will see later in the course, they're both really significant anthropologists, write this article where they talk about the three bodies. All right, and this is, again, a sort of theoretical framework for thinking about the body and embodiment. So what I want to do is just kind of run through what the three bodies are, because I think you're going to find all three of them, right, or this sort of understanding of the body in these three parts as a useful tool. Okay. So they start from the premise that, as I've alluded to earlier in the lecture, that the body is both a physical and a symbolic artifact, that it's both naturally and culturally produced. In other words, yeah, we're not going to deny the sort of the biology of the human body, but as anthropologists, we're also going to think about how we live our embodied lives in a cultural context, right? And how culture informs, how we experience our own bodies, right? And how our bodies are received by others. So understanding this at the sort of intersection of the biology and the culture of the body. So the individual body, right? These are the three bodies: individual, social, and body politic, right? So the individual body, this goes to that question of embodiment that I discussed earlier. So the individual body is the body as experienced and conceptualized, right? It's still culturally variable. The individual body as lived by me in my cultural world is not the same as everywhere in the world and across time. But it's about, right, me, the sort of individual living in my own body self, is the term that they use. Some of that variability, though, is quite significant, right, and quite notable. So we could talk, for example, about the typical sort of Western model of an individual body self, right, that I have autonomy and that my body self is singular, right? Like that's the cultural model of the sort of Western embodied person. That's not the model everywhere. So for example, just as one example of this, my own research has to do with, among other things, people who experience spirit possession, which is a very common thing in lots of places in the world, right? That people's bodies are understood as essentially porous, right? That your body can be inhabited, even temporarily, by more than one person, right? So spirit possession is precisely when your quote-unquote self sort of steps aside and some other self, some other person becomes part of your body, right? Or inhabits your body. So that's a very different model of what the individual body is and what the relationship between body and self is, right? So the individual body is an important sort of one of the bodies for thinking about how people experience embodiment. But again, we always want to remember how variable that is across time and space. The second of the bodies, as they call them, is the social body, right? And this is the idea that which again I've already mentioned multiple times, but that the body, like bodily experience and the social body experience are intertwined, right? And they're often understood as analogous, right? So for example, it's just as an aside, it's interesting. We're in this sort of at the height of the political season right now. So we're hearing a lot of political rhetoric of various sorts in the news. I encourage you to pay attention to the ways in which the political discourse, right, that is politicians talking in public, right, how much of it includes gender, sexuality, and the body, right? So in various ways. So just kind of keep your ear on that because I think you'll find it quite interesting. And this is one of the things, for example, that Shepard, Hughes, and Locke were talking about when they talk about the social body. That the physical body, the individual body, is often used as sort of a symbol or almost like a map for rhetoric or conversations about the social body, right? So the idea of a quote-unquote healthy society, right, or a sick society, those are metaphors, right? It's thinking about an individual human body and using some of those characteristics to describe the state of something like a country or a nation state, right? So Shepard, Hughes, and Locke are saying the second of these bodies is that sort of analogous individual body, social body, and the ways those two things are often paralleled. And the final one is what they call the body politic, which means that the body is often the site of political control. And that intersects with the politics of the nation state often. So it might take the form of, as I give an example here, of sort of expectations around controlling one's individual body, There's a lot of that is gendered. So we know, for example, that historically women's bodies are policed as regards their weight and shape and body language and various other issues, right? So that's sort of an example of body politic. And I think we can also talk about the ways that geopolitics, again, are sort of projected onto individual bodies, whether it's, bodies crossing borders or whatever else, right? So let's keep talking about the three bodies. I'll give you a few more examples just to sort of bring home this theoretical model that they are putting forward. So the individual body, as I said, is sort of the individual body self. Now, in a Western context, we often fall back on this sort of assumed model of the mind body. This is a sort of coming from the philosopher René Descartes, the idea of mind-body dualism, the idea that your mind is sort of the higher entity that inhabits your body, so to speak, and often distinctions made between mind and body. That's a very culturally specific model of the individuated body. I mentioned spirit possession. We have lots of examples cross-culturally of body selves or individual bodies that don't operate along the lines of what Descartes and Western cultural assumptions suggest, right? So I mentioned spirit possession in my own field work. The other example I want to provide here, which is the image from the bottom, is the work of an anthropologist named Marina Roseman, who did long-term field work in Malaysia. And what she learned, the people there that she worked with are called the Temiar. And what she learned is that the people in her field site understood individual persons as permeable and as composed of multiple selves that were in fact detachable. So there were these different, as they were called, different kinds of like spirits that were part of you, right? Head spirit, heart spirit, etc., right? And what she learned is those different parts of self could go away, right? They might leave you. They might go off in the forest when you were walking because they were attracted by something else. And that was often understood to be the source of illness, right? She's a medical anthropologist. So what you see on the bottom then is a healing ritual meant to sort of reconnect a wayward self or a wayward spirit back to the person, because in reconstituting all those selves in the body, that person can return to health, right? So again, these are just two examples of the individual body, right? And what that individual body self looks like in a particular cultural context. And they're obviously really different from one another. So we still want to think about the individual body as a useful theoretical tool, but with a clear understanding of the wide variability that we can find in those individual body selves. One of the theories connected to this idea of embodiment and the sort of understanding the individual body is phenomenology, which comes out of philosophy, but is actually widely used in medical anthropology. And this is an approach that emphasizes the lived, experienced world, right? So that is sort of how it feels to live in and through one's body, right? As really where the world is created, is through your experience. So one of the key anthropologists working on that is a guy named Thomas Chordas, who argues that the body is the existential ground of culture and self, right? So this is one of the ways that the individual body is theorized in cultural anthropology. The social body, on the other hand, is, as I said, sort of that the body and the social, or the individual body and the social, are not separate, but they're sort of parallel or analogous, right? So one of the ways of thinking about this is that the body, the individual body, is a sort of symbol of the social body. Here on the screen is an example from the work of an anthropologist named Jean Komaroff, where she's looking at settlements in South Africa. And this image is actually a mapping of a settlement where, if you can see some of it's a little bit hard to see because of the way it was reproduced, but that there are parts of the way that the sort of neighborhood is set up, right? The way the village is set up, there are parts that are understood as sort of male parts and parts that are understood as female parts. And the ways these things are organized allude to individual bodies, right? And relationships, right? Including sort of alluding to biological reproduction. So the individual sort of physical body is mapped onto the way that houses and communities and the neighborhood is set up in a way that makes that connection between individual and social body. So again, that's just sort of one example. And the body politic. The body is a site of political control. One example from the work by a scholar named Susan Bordo, who's not an anthropologist, she's a humanities scholar, but she looked at gender and illness, and particularly looked at some sort of illness categories over historical time. And she argues about three illnesses or illness categories, really reflecting expectations about women at that historical moment and how those expectations were projected onto bodies. So hysteria, which was a 19th century affliction that primarily affected women, has often been interpreted as sort of reflecting some of the tensions of the Victorian era and the expectations of women during that time period. Agoraphobia, which is basically the fear of leaving your home, there was heightened experience of agoraphobia among middle-class women during the 1950s, and she suggests that has to do with or is connected to the cult of domesticity that was part of 1950s culture, where women were, which was a change at the time, women were suddenly expected to be in the home and finding their primary purpose in the home through domestic duties, etc. And so we see a rise of agoraphobia during that area. And anorexia, which primarily affected women, continues to. We saw a real increase during the 1980s and is often connected to questions of control and bodily control. So again, she's making the argument, not at all to suggest that these aren't, actual experiences of illness, etc., but that these illness categories are connected to certain sort of gendered expectations in society and a politics of control, particularly of women's body, that was in place at a particular moment in time and was implicated in the rise of these illnesses. So what she's arguing is that a sort of exaggerated version of the feminine ideal of a particular historical moment became sort of inscribed on the body. So it was enforced through the pathologizing of these conditions. The final example I'll give of this concept of the body politic is looking at border politics and the policing of migrants crossing borders. Certainly a timely example for things going on particularly our southern border in the United States. One of the key anthropologists who have theorized this question of borders is a guy named Michael Kearney. And he really looked at the emphasis on maintaining borders and controlling the bodies of migrants who would cross those borders. And he included, particularly looking at the U.S.-Mexico border, looking at the role of coyotes in sort of facilitating that passage, and that idea of the crossing of the border as being a sort of significant sociocultural act, and also one that intersects with the politics of the nation state. So the sort of physical borders, particularly as we've seen an increase in the creating of these physical borders and the militarization and policing of geopolitical borders, anthropologists would suggest is also an assertion of sort of the boundaries around the body politic that affects the individual bodies of people who would cross those borders. Okay, so we've made it through our sort of overview of cultural anthropology, our discussion of the 4 review articles, and I want to end now this probably overly long lecture. And again, as I said in the beginning, most of the lectures in the class will not be quite this long, but we had sort of a lot of things to just get up and running for this first one, so that's the reason that it's longer than it probably should be. But let me end with some sort of key take-homes from the unit, right? So these are the things that I want you to take away from everything that we've read and discussed. And these are the things that I think cut across everything that you've read and all the things that have been part of the lecture, okay? So there's a few key things. The first is the cultural and historical variability of gender sexuality in the body. We'll see lots of different examples. I want you to maintain your understanding of how culture operates and of cultural relativism as we look at that variability. The second is that anthropologists in general, and maybe anthropologists of gender sexuality in the body in particular, are really committed to unpacking categories and challenging binaries. We'll also be doing a lot of that in the course. A lot of what we'll be doing also is about a critique of the institutions and ideologies that assert categories and inform gender experiences. So again, not just the categories that circulate culturally, but also the institutions like government, religion, institutions around family, education, all of those ways in which a lot of these expectations and assertions are enforced. We'll be also sort of engaging in a critique of those processes. Another idea is really the embeddedness of gender, sexuality, and embodiment in global political economy. So that's the overlap or the intersection between individual embodied experience and social and political bodies. Really, some of the stuff we were just talking about. You'll see that as well as we move through the course. So none of these examples none of these ethnographic examples of gender and sexuality are in a vacuum. Wherever they are in the world, they're also part of this sort of broader set of forces that tie everything together. A few more things, the importance of language. So both sort of how we communicate about these issues and how we write about them as anthropologists. Both of those are going to be ongoing themes. The challenge and promise of interdisciplinarity. I hope you've already noted in those review articles that the work that all of those authors were talking about, yeah, they're all about anthropology. So there was a lot of talk of anthropologists, but there was also a lot of mention of other fields that anthropologists contribute to or draw from. So these are very interdisciplinary areas that we'll be talking about. And anthropologists working in these areas owe a lot to and continue to engage with broader scholarly fields, right? Like feminist studies go far beyond cultural anthropology. So we want to think about all the ways in which cultural anthropologists engage with historians and political scientists and et cetera, right? That's part of the work. And then finally, I think all of these pieces have really put out a call for working toward theoretical frameworks that go beyond this concept of enumeration. So in other words, theoretical tools that would allow us to look at these issues without assuming the existence of the very categories that we're trying to analyze or make sense of, right? So both Bollstorff and Gutman made a call for this, and I think it's a good challenge as well for us to keep thinking about as we do a lot more reading about these subjects in the course. So thank you for bearing with me on this long journey of thinking through all these sort of preliminaries and basic ideas to get us going in the course. The next unit will get a little bit more specific in terms of topic. So any questions about any of this, please let me know, and we will talk again soon. Bye-bye.